Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. Can you hear me well? Just want to test if it's recording. Can you hear me well? Okay. According to the device, it is recording, and I should... Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you. So welcome back, everyone. It's great to see all of you here today for a second session. Today on the topic of EU enlargement. So we shift lenses by transitioning from European disintegration, discussing the only case of withdrawal of a former member state from the European Union, namely the United Kingdom. And now we look into European integration. So how can the EU, in what ways, and what the underlying challenges are of the European Union in widening European integration by letting other candidate states join the European Union. The conversation about enlargement will follow next week with Professor Michael Kemper, who will discuss illustrative examples of enlargement, primarily focusing on the Western Balkans, and discuss it through the lens of history, so from an historical lens. Enlargement is a topic which regrettably cannot be covered in 2 hours. Therefore, it is important that you take the opportunity to engage with my colleague in the following week on the same topic, but through a different perspective. Today, the lecture plan is quite ambitious. I hope I'll cover everything concisely within the allocated time frame. So today we'll be looking at the legal framework comprising a number of hard and soft legal instruments which regulate enlargement in the European Union, the main institutions and actors involved in the decision-making process. We'll dive into the process itself, the pitfalls, challenges, limits, and taking a step back, we'll reflect on the possible scenarios of enlargement. As I anticipated yesterday, the European Commission, in its 2030 enlargement package, has promised an enlarged European Union. Commission President von der Leyen last year in the State of Union address, she emphasized the importance of having a stronger, therefore, an enlarged Europe with more member states on the face of threats, given the very unsettling and pressing geopolitical developments which are of concern and therefore have contributed to put forward the enlargement agenda in the European Union. But where we stand and what the positions of the actors involved are, including the member state who have last say in the process, is something which we'll explore during this lecture. What are the learning goals? What are you expected to learn and to take away from this lecture? To provide you with the foundation knowledge so that you can dive deeper next week in the follow-up of the conversation on enlargement. So at the end of this lecture, you are expected, and hopefully so, to learn to be able to map the actual provisions in the treaty framework that governs enlargement of the European Union, then look into more specific criteria, so substantive and procedural criteria and conditions which inform the process, describe and at the same time assess the role of the institutions and actors involved, their power in the process to move it forward, but also to block it, as actually history has shown until now with the enlargement process. And on that note, also reflect on possible gateways to escape what happened in the past experiences with regard to the delayed accession process of country because of decision-making procedures, namely unanimity by in the Council by some member state, which seemingly let their national agendas prevail over the agenda of the EU for an enlarged Europe. But how this has unfolded will be discussed in the following slide. Now, on this picture, you see, can you recognize this picture first? Let me ask you first. What does this picture remind you of? So, the European Economic Community was established back in time in 1957 through the Treaty of Rome by 6 member states, namely Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So the EU was created in the aftermath of the Second World War to support, to enhance economic cooperation. The idea behind was that countries who traded, who trade with another become economically interdependent and so more likely to avoid wars and conflict. So that was the initial premise behind. And therefore, in 51, so this picture dates back to 51, 6 countries founded the European Coal and Steel Committee. And later, in 1957, the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community was established, which entered into force later in 58. And those 6 were the founding members. Now, the old European Economic Community has evolved over time, expanding the objectives pursued by the now European Union from economic to non-economic, and therefore the EU is no longer composed by 6, but now by 27 member states of the European Union. However, to join the European Union requires aspiring countries, the candidate countries, to align their legal systems within the EU's values, so to embrace, to respect the EU's values, and to align their body of legislation, their domestic legal order, with the European legislation and guidelines, so with the so-term acquis communautaire, to ensure a smooth integration into the European Union. Accession also serves as a tool of EU external policy encouraging neighboring states to adopt European standards. However, is the path easy, and what are the challenges of the EU in its role as a global actor in relationship with third countries? Some of them with accession agreements signed with the EU, and those in the Western Balkans with accession and stabilization agreements signed with the EU, aspiring to become future member states. The EU itself is confronted with a range of complex challenges that test its resilience, unity, and integration. And we discussed yesterday the example of Brexit, how European integration was put to test through the case of, with the case of Brexit. One of the most pressing issues, which for the very first time is informing the enlargement agenda of the EU, is geopolitics, which was not into the conversation in the past accessions. Now this has turned into a priority. So geopolitical instability, particularly the war in Ukraine, and very recently now the war in the Middle East, has reshaped security policies and reinforced the need for European defense cooperation. The EU also faces democratic and rule of law challenges internally. You could probably remind here the past heated relationship with Hungary and Poland, but also externally, which concern matters like judicial independence, fundamental rights. The war in Ukraine and Russia's influence in the Western Balkans, in the East, have rekindled the conversation on the enlarged Europe. is enlargement nowadays a step forward or a backward move? And this is a question which has to be addressed from an EU angle, but also from the perspective of each member state, which will have a say in the Council through decision-making, through unanimity. By integrating new members, the EU extends its sphere of influence and creates a larger, a more interconnected market that enhances trade, investment, cooperation, strengthens security. Enlargement also serves as a tool for geopolitical stability because it supports and it encourages democratic governance and legal reforms in the candidate country. And together with the member states, the European Union as a global actor in the wider world actively contributes to prevent conflicts, to advance human rights, rule of law, with a view to reinforcing a rule-based international order. And a key instrument to achieve those objectives, to embrace those values, is the enlargement policy, which, by the way, has been put on hold since 2013, with Croatia being the last state which joined the European Union. Now, by offering the prospect of membership to a European state, the EU encourages neighboring countries to adopt democratic principles, legal reform, ensure economic stability, security, therefore respecting and aligning with European values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. So enlargement is not only about expanding the European Union, but is also about strengthening stability in Europe and beyond it. But who are those who actually lead the enlargement agenda in the European Union? Do you recognize them? Who is who from this slide? And these are the highest political figures who actually drive the enlargement agenda at European level and relationship with the candidate states. Do you recognize any of them? Yes? Who would like to? Yeah, please. You could just say what you think. Excellent. Yeah, she's President of the European Commission. And next to her? No, next to her, next to the President of the European Commission? The lady next to her? She heads a very important European institution. Exactly, Roberta Metsola. And below, on the left side, on topics of enlargement, you'll see him often on the news. Not only, but also on topics concerning safety, security, defense, together with the colleague next to him. They'll be often on the news. So Antonio Costa, who is the president of the Council, and who holds now the presidency of the Council, which rotates every 6 months. Yes, correct. So Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, presidency now is with Cyprus. Next to him, Kaja Kallas, the High Representative of the European Union, which is really a key figure because she also serves as a Vice President of the European Commission on foreign policy. And together with Antonio Costa, they ensure the external representation of the European Union on issues pertaining to common foreign security policy, common security, and defense. And lastly, next to the High Representative is another key figure in external relation and specifically on enlargement. Enlargement is her favorite topic. Which institutions does she represent? She's very enthusiastic about the agenda of the EU on the topic, on the subject for which she is responsible. Marta Kos, European Commissioner for Enlargement. She drives the European Union's enlargement process forward, and she is responsible for developing and fostering the EU's relations with countries in the region, including Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, with several of them potential and candidate countries to join the European Union. She is responsible for working with each potential candidate and candidate country on their merit-based, for a merit-based process to join the European Union by supporting the required structural legal reform, economic reforms, the respect for rule of law, European values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, and for strengthening their resilience and preparedness to join the European Union. So these are representatives of the key institutions which are involved in the process. What is missing on the picture are 27 member states who are also key actors in the process itself. Now, let's go back to the treaty framework which governs the EU enlargement. What values does the EU pursue in its enlargement agenda, and where can we find them? The objectives the EU pursues and the principles upon which the EU builds on its actions, not only internally at Union level, but also externally, including the enlargement agenda, are enshrined in Article 3, Paragraph 5 of the Treaty of the European Union and Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. And their aim and also the purpose is for the EU to commit itself to uphold and promote its core values externally with third countries. In the wider world, the EU's external action are rooted in principles that have shaped the EU's own foundation: democracy, rule of law, human rights, equality, respect for human dignity. These are not empty words. And through its foreign policy and engagement with third countries, the EU works to protect citizens beyond borders, promote peace and security, foster stability in the region, and strengthen international law by adhering to the principles of the United Nations Charter, to which the EU also is a signatory, with a view to protecting human rights. And it's exactly these commitments which reflect the EU's own journey to European integration, but also enlargement with countries which are not yet member states of the European Union, but they are part of a path to accession process into the European Union. Some of them, as you'll see in the following slide, have been on the queue for a very long time. How does the EU represent the Union values in relationship with those countries? Actually, the EU is a legal person. is a legal entity with its own legal personality and is capable of undertaking rights and obligations like other legal persons. And this is enshrined in Article 47 of the Treaty of the European Union, which explicitly provides that the Union shall have legal personality. This is the reason why the EU can position itself as a signatory in international agreements with countries wishing to become members of the European Union, but also in other types of international agreement. So thanks to that provision, which recognizes legal personality of the European Union to undertake rights and obligations, like the states, even though the Union is not a state, is rather a sui generis international organization. This formal recognition under Article 47 aims at strengthening the role in global governance and enable it to negotiate international agreements and represent the Union's values and legitimate interests in foreign policy. Subsequently, Article 335 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union assigns the European Commission, and therefore we have a European Commissioner responsible for enlargement, only on that subject. So Article 335 assigns the European Commission as a primary representative of the European Union in external affairs. However, it also acknowledges the administrative autonomy of other EU institutions, like European Council, like the High Representative of the European Union, permitting them to act independently in matters within their scope of competencies as contained in the treaties, in the TU and in the TFEU. The member states are also involved, but they have delimited powers. At the same time, the EU member states, which have conferred those powers to the EU institutions under the principle of conferral of powers, have at the same time delimited the scope of those powers as contained in Declaration 25 attached to the treaties. This declaration, which foresees that the European Union will not in any way authorize the Union to legislate or to act beyond the competences conferred upon it by the member state in the treaties. So this provision tells us that the declaration attached to it, which is part of the treaty, so even though declarations and protocols are not contained in the main text of the treaties, they are part of the treaties. So these declarations, as a legal instruments, serve as a safeguard with a view to emphasizing that the EU can only act within the scope of the powers conferred by the member states. And this is to ensure that the EU does not act beyond the scope of those powers, which would otherwise upset the institutional balance of powers of the European Union. So now we understand that in its enlargement policy, the EU pursues a set of objectives which are enshrined in Article 3, Paragraph 5, and in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. And the Union itself, as a legal person, as a global actor, as a legal entity, can undertake rights and obligations in agreements that concludes with countries wishing to join the European Union. But let's take a moment and look backward to understand better the waves of enlargement of the European Union. How we started back in 1957 as a community, as an economic community of 6 member states, and where do we stand now as a union of 27 member states with one member that we lost like the UK. So the regional community, which started with 6 members, has undergone several rounds of enlargement. Some countries joined in bloc, like Denmark, Ireland, and the UK in 1973, and later Austria, Finland, and Sweden, and particularly in 2004. There was a great bloc of 10 states which joined the European Union. This was the most significant enlargement wave, which has not repeated itself until now. And the process ended in 2013. For some years, the enlargement debate was put on hold, but since the war in Ukraine started, the enlargement debate was rekindled because of geopolitical concerns. The legal framework for enlargement comprises 2 main provisions in the treaties, namely Article 49, the major provision in the treaty, and Article 42, which emphasizes the adherence to a set of European values enshrined in the treaty, which the EU respects internally, so the member state respect internally, and the EU and the member state expect candidate countries to respect when joining the European Union. And the framework, so these 2 main provisions, have been further operationalized through a number of legal instruments, like the Copenhagen Declaration by the European Council back in 1993, and numerous soft guidelines and other legal and other soft norms which aim at further implementing these 2 provisions. But the only provisions in the treaty, which also are a form of hard law, are Articles 49 and Article 42 and Article 2 in the Treaty of the European Union. Now, I'm going to walk you into those 2 provisions and discuss their scope, their limitations, their challenges by illustrating them through examples based on institutional practice. Who is eligible for EU membership? Can every state or country, are there actually substantive difference between these 2 wording, state or country, which could apply for EU membership? According to Article 49, paragraph 1 of the Treaty of the European Union, there are 3 main criteria that one has to meet in order to apply for membership. First, to become an EU member, a country must first be recognized as a sovereign state. So not every country can qualify to apply for a membership. First, it must be recognized as a sovereign state. And here it comes, a still ongoing issue with one country versus state in the Western Balkans, Kosovo. So Kosovo is a state which has been recognized as such by member states of the European Union, with the exception of 5 of them, which contest statehood. So for those 5, Kosovo is not a state, but it is a country yet, because it's not a sovereign state. So they contest statehood of Kosovo. So, and this is a non-negotiable condition based on Article 49, paragraph 1, TFEU. So the question therefore remains, what is the current status of Kosovo in the accession process? Kosovo is currently a potential candidate country to join the European Union. Therefore, to the best of your knowledge, how could Kosovo overcome this obstacle, this barrier arising from paragraph 1 of Article 49, if it's not yet recognized by 5 member states of the EU as a sovereign state, therefore being, according to them, still a country? Feel free to share your inputs based on what you know now, or based on what you know until now, because after this lecture you certainly will know more, but at least based on what you have read and discussions you might have followed, how could Kosovo overcome this barrier following from Article 49 to be eligible to apply for formal membership to the European Union, despite being still a potential candidate, but it has started the process formally? Any idea? To overcome this barrier?
Unless you get recognized by the EU member states. So I suppose they could send diplomatic mission to those states and try to get recognized as states in the country.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's a valid point. So, in fact, Kosovo is the example of a state which is not recognized as such by 5 member states, and that actually put a severe obstacle in the process. The reason being that the membership in the EU requires as a formal condition to conclude an agreement with the European Union. And you've discussed mixity with my colleague Matteo, in which you have learned that the EU can sign 2 types of agreements with third countries and international organizations, which are first EU alone agreement, which means the EU can conclude those agreements alone, and that applies to policy areas where the EU has exclusive competencies like competition, trade, but in other policy areas such as shared or coordinating, the EU can act jointly with the member states, because in those policy areas the EU has to share its power jointly with the member states as prescribed in the treaty. Now, there were actually some legal barriers to prevent the EU from signing a stabilization association agreement with Kosovo to therefore start accession process. And the EU was able to overcome it. And the history of EU legal order will have only one example of a stabilization association agreement which has been signed by a state, namely Kosovo, by the EU alone, and not together with the member states. And the reason for this were actually announced at the time by the European Commissioner responsible for foreign policy, and she made it clear at the time that the reasons are purely political from member states, and therefore to overcome this obstacle, the EU signed the agreement alone. But it was made clear that the signature of that agreement does not automatically amount to recognition of statehood in Kosovo, which was the reason why 5 member states were opposing systematically to sign the Stabilization Association Agreement with Kosovo. So this is how this barrier was overcome. But it's actually a unique example in the history of EU legal order that we have only one case where a Stabilization Association Agreement is signed by the EU alone. And that was by the European Commissioner responsible for foreign policy and enlargement. In all kind of international agreements, association agreements, and stabilization association agreements, which applies to countries in the Western Balkans, you will see that those agreements are jointly signed by the EU and the member states, which must have a say in the process, because enlargement falls under policy area, so foreign policy, where member states have competence to act jointly with the European Union. So this is how the first barrier was overcome by the European Union. The second criteria, which follows from Article 49, is that a country must be geographically on the European continent. But the provision itself is silent as to what that actually means. And that has triggered some tension in the past with Morocco, which actually has applied for formal membership, but that was dismissed by the European Union, the reason being that Morocco was not considered as state which was geographically on the European continent. So the Article 49 itself does not fully capture those tensions, which certainly would leave room for the Court of Justice to interpret, given that it does not give a straight answer to questions, therefore putting to test the scope of application of these provisions in contested cases. And beyond geography and sovereignty, a candidate country must also respect and promote the values enshrined in Article 2 with regard to democracy, human rights, rule of law, and respect for minorities. And these are assessed every year by the European Commission and published in the Rule of Law report that I'm going to show you in one of the slides to see where those countries stand in their annual assessment and to what extent they comply with those values which represent or which are a criteria for the EU to assess the progress in the accession process. Now, Article 49, apart from those substantive criteria, also contain a number of procedural criteria for a candidate country to join the European Union. Now, Article 49, so there are only two provisions. You don't have much to read in the treaties. You have only Article 49 and Article 2, and the rest follows with numerous soft legal instruments. So Article 49 is presented as a neutral accession procedure article. So, but in reality, it's a short legal article that opens a long, politically saturated process and hotly debated. This article sets out who may apply, which institutions must be involved, and how membership is ultimately approved by the member states in the Council. But it also structures where power sits. And sometimes it turns into a gatekeeper, especially with unanimity in the Council, but also followed by national ratification at national level as a final veto. Now, as we indicated earlier, Article 49 starts already with a condition, which reads as follows: any European state that respects Article 2 value may apply. So this looks an objective requirement, but it is not self-explanatory. So European is not a technical geographical term in EU law. It's an open concept. And a classical illustration, as I indicated, is the application of Morocco back in 1987, which was rejected because Morocco was not considered a European state because of its geographic location. So then consider the European values provision in Article 2. So a state which respects and promotes values, which suggests in itself, based on the text, a normative threshold. But it also raises some hard questions. Who decides what counts as respect or promotion? And how consistently is that standard applied for every country scrutinized in the accession process until it passes unanimity in the Council? In practice, those values are assessed through different benchmarks, such as conditionality, monitoring, and other economic benchmarks, often facilitated and led by the European Commission itself. Yet the process is also inseparable from the member state politics. So this therefore creates some tension in the process. So Article 49 frames succession as a value-based and merit-based process, but the decision-making procedure allows strategic behavior in the Council that may unfold in practice as unrelated to those values. Article 49 requires member states, the 27 member states in the Council, to vote unanimously after consulting the European Commission and after getting the consent of the European Parliament. So therefore, this turns enlargement into a domain of collective actors. Every member state can block accession process. Even one of them suffices to block it. And we'll see a number of examples of how this has actually happened in the past. So a single member state suffices to block accession in the Council by vetoing it as a result of the unanimity, which is the only decision-making procedure. Now, the veto can be used for principled reasons, but it can also be used because of some bilateral disputes pending between a member state and a candidate country to join the European Union, or because of some domestic political signaling from the home countries of ministers sitting in the Council and voting for a candidate country. So an example is how North Macedonia was blocked and was repeatedly delayed through Bulgaria due to heated disputes between these two countries. So domestic politics prevailed over the broader interests of the EU to advance the enlargement agenda. But the member states are not the only one which can block decision-making. The European Parliament can also do that because the Parliament is required to give consent before member state would vote. So on the one hand, the involvement of the Parliament adds democratic weight to the process, and it's good news for us as citizens because it's a democratic institution, the members of which are directly voted by the European citizens. So seen from the lens of democracy and legitimacy, so it adds weight to the process, but it introduces an additional layer of political gate because consent is required. The European Parliament can credibly threaten to block the process, and that power can strengthen rights and rule of law conditions on the one hand, but it can also pull enlargement debates into party politics in the European Parliament and geopolitical framing. So Article 49, with these three institutions, so the Council, the European Commission European Council voting with the unanimity, through unanimity, with all member states involved, European Commission being consulted, and the European Parliament giving consent, and bear in mind the dynamics of political parties in the Parliament regarding the topic, regarding the conversation about the enlarged Europe. So Article 49 creates a multi-level legitimacy scenario with an yearly assessment of the European Commission, with the consent of the European Parliament and the Council unanimity. So while also multiplying veto points and bargaining arenas. So Article 49 makes clear that accession requires an agreement, which is the accession treaty, and ratification by all member states, according to their constitutional requirements. Most member states will vote through a referenda, but others might not, so that depends what their requirements are in their national legal order and specifically in their national constitution. So this is where EU level meets domestic politics. Because after negotiations conclude, national ratification can fail. And the referenda in Norway in 72 and 94 illustrate this point. So the accession process of a candidate country can collapse at every stage, even at the final setup, because of domestic choices of some member states. So this is a constitutional reality, but it underscores that Article 49 does not guarantee accession even when negotiations are technically complete. So what can we conclude about Article 49? Article 49 is a constitutional architecture that allocates powers and creates incentives. It can protect the Union by requiring unanimity and broader consent, but at the same time, it can also undermine credibility by enabling vetoes in the Council for reasons that can look arbitrary to candidates. And Article 49 has often turned, in reality, in practice, has often turned enlargement into a chain of veto points by letting national agenda prevail over the enlargement agenda of the interests of the EU. And the following slide actually illustrates that. So several potential and candidate countries have had and still have ongoing disputes with member states, which as a result of those disputes have blocked decision-making in the Council. That was the case with North Macedonia. This is the case with Kosovo and Serbia, both blocked by member state in the accession process. Albania blocked by Greece in the past, and Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro blocked by Croatia. Actually, in the Western Balkans, Croatia is a country which is most advanced in the accession process, but until now, it is yet unknown whether Croatia will block Montenegro in the Council because of bilateral disputes which are yet unresolved between the two countries. And in a press conference last year, the Prime Minister of Montenegro admitted that. He said that we are working towards that, but there is no guarantee that this cannot happen because it already happened so far in the Council. Ukraine, blocked by both Poland and Hungary, and counting on more disputes. So you see how domestic politics can actually prevail over the broader and wider interests of the European Union as far as the enlargement agenda is concerned. And of course, unanimity here plays the major role. Now, I mentioned earlier Article 2. It is extremely important. It actually informs decision-making with regard to compliance with the values enshrined in the treaty. But where do those candidate countries stand with regard to compliance with European values? I suggest a short break before we continue with our remaining slides for this lecture. So I will suggest 5 to 10 minutes, and we can continue afterwards. Thank you. Okay, we can continue. Can you hear me well? Because I realized that you had some issues. Can you hear me well? Those at the end, can you hear me? Those at the end, can you hear me well? Can you hear me well? Those at the end? Oh, now you heard better. Now can you hear me? It's better. Apparently there are some issues with the audio. Yeah. Oh, it's hard. Okay, I think in case you don't hear me well, please raise your hand. Thank you. So, as indicated earlier, based on Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, candidate countries, potential candidate countries to join the European Union must demonstrate that they respect the values, European values enshrined in Article 2 with regard to respect to rule of law, democracy, human rights, as contained in the treaties. And the European Commission will monitor compliance with those values on a yearly basis as contained in the rule of law reports. And where do the potential and candidate countries stand in terms of outcome from the early assessment? What we see with the countries primarily in the Western Balkans, we see rising concerns every year with regard to high level of corruption, censorship to media, violation of human rights to minority groups, and a lack of independence of judiciary, which has been flagged yearly by the European Commission. So in that regard, there is a slowed progress with countries in the Western Balkans. Now, as far as the criteria for accession are concerned, so now moving beyond the letters of the treaty, namely Article 2 and Article 49 TEU, the candidate and potential candidate countries, so the European states with which to join the European Union, must also comply with additional criteria and conditions for accession, which are laid down in a Council declaration, quite an old one dating back to 1993, which has prompted often the question as to whether those criteria must be revised to align with the current dynamics in light of geopolitical development. But until the moment of speaking, the criteria remain as they are in the original declaration. As formulated in 1993. So a meeting of European Council that took place in Madrid in 1993 agreed on some criteria, some conditions for European states to become member of the European Union. And those criteria are also known as Copenhagen criteria, naming after the city where that declaration was signed. And those criteria can be grouped into four main categories, namely political, economic, institutional, and administrative. The political criteria require a European state to have stable institutions which can guarantee democracy, rule of law, human rights, and respect for and protection for minorities, which, as I indicated, the European Commission will monitor and assess on a yearly basis through the rule of law reports, which, as you probably might know, are also published yearly, not only for third countries, but also for the actual member states of the European Union. The economic criteria require a potential candidate and a candidate country to have a functioning market economy and the capacity to keep up with internal market and other market forces. The administrative and institutional criteria require potential and a candidate country to effectively implement legislation which is compliant with the European legislation, and therefore asking those countries to comply with the EU acquis, or known also as the EU as acquis communautaire, or through the short name EU acquis. EU acquis is a technical term which refers to the body of common rights and obligations that is binding on the EU member states, to which constantly evolves and comprises a number of hard and soft law legal instruments, starting with the treaties, general principles of EU law, European legislation, non-legislative act, but also soft legal instruments such as declarations, resolutions by the European Union, Council decisions under common foreign and security policy, international agreements concluded by the Union alone or together with a member state, declarations, etc. So the body of European legislation and soft legal instruments, which form part of the EU legal order, must turn into a reference point by those third countries which are required to adopt their legislation in compliance with the EU legislation. This is based on the premise that once they become member of the European Union, the European legislation will prevail over national legal order, which is general principles of EU law born out of case law, known also as the principle, one of the general principles or judge-made principle, and lying at the center of the EU legal order. The accession process comprises 6 stages. I'm going to walk you through each of these and understand better their scope of application, challenges, and pitfalls. So first, a European state must apply for formal membership based on Article 49 of the Treaty of the European Union. And that article required third country to first present its application to the Council of Europe. And this is a highly political act, and usually such an application will already have been discussed in extensive political discussions behind the closed doors. This formal request will usually not occur until it's relatively certain that a positive reply will follow, and this is within a reasonable time period. Once a third country has submitted its application to the European Council for formal membership, so once the third country has submitted the application for formal membership to the European Union, the European Council will request the opinion of the European Commission. A response to the Council may then come rather swiftly, or it may not. In the case of Morocco, the rejection came soon after its application in 1987, but Turkey received its formal candidate status only in 1997, 10 years after it submitted its application. And in any case, any third country when a third country has presented its application, the Council will request the Commission to submit its opinion on this application in line with Article 49 of the Treaty of the European Union. Once the formal application of the country has been submitted to the European Council, we move to the second stage. The ambassadors from now the 27 member states, also known as permanent representatives to the European Union, will vote unanimously within the Council to ask the European Commission to examine the membership application. The examination of the European Commission can take several months or even years. Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance, applied in 2016, but the Commission did not issue its recommendation for to accept a formal membership until 2019, so until 2020, so it took 6 years. On the other hand, Ukraine and Moldova, who submitted their application in early 2022, the Commission took only a few weeks within the same year accepting their application. So we see here how geopolitical interests prevail over what we could term as a merit-based process. This is a question open for discussion. Next, the European Parliament must express its majority support for the opening of the negotiations. And finally, it will be a unanimous decision of the member states in the Council after consultation with the other two institutions, the Commission and the Parliament, that the application for candidate status is officially accepted. And this status is no guarantee to EU membership. There are years that some candidate countries are waiting on the queue for membership. At present, we have 8 countries with candidate status. They are Albania, North Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine. And we have Kosovo as a potential candidate country. At the same time, as indicated earlier, obtaining the candidate status has turned into a bottleneck for some countries. For instance, Kosovo is not yet a candidate country because of unresolved conflict with Serbia, and this unresolved conflict has been set as a condition to accession to both countries to the European Union. Serbia is a candidate country, but Kosovo is still a potential candidate country. And as long as this conflict is not solved, there won't be an advancement to the candidacy of Kosovo in the process. Here, you might argue, should the EU take a proactive role in the process? And in which way can the EU facilitate the negotiations? Some critical voices argue that the EU is remaining neutral. Some others claim that actually this should be left to the countries involved, to the states involved, to resolve and therefore progress in the negotiations. So depends what perspective you might embrace, but certainly this has delayed both countries in the process. On the other hand, Macedonia, because of its name, in the past it was named Macedonia, now it has changed its name into North Macedonia. It was blocked for 16 years, firstly by Greece, and lately, until recently, by Bulgaria in the accession process. And this connects to the earlier argument as to how some member states are letting their domestic politics to prevail over the enlargement agenda to benefit the interests of the European Union. Before the start of the negotiation, so after a country has been granted the candidate status, before the start of the negotiations, the candidate country establishes its pre-accession strategy with the European Commission. This is a program of European support and financial aid which aims to support a candidate country to carry out administrative, political, and economic reforms to meet the Copenhagen criteria. At this stage of the procedure, new eligibility criteria are introduced. 3 additional conditions, commonly referred as to Copenhagen criteria that we discussed earlier. There is also a fourth consideration, that the EU also must show to have absorption capacity, the capacity to absorb, which means to welcome a new member state. And this condition, from the EU perspective now, is known as the absorption capacity or integration capacity of the European Union to welcome a new member state. And this explains why the European Commission actively ponders how its policies, budget, and institutions might need to be adapted to an enlarged union. But let's pause for a moment and try to zoom in on the past accession timelines. How much it took to some of the current member states of the European Union to meet those conditions and criteria that we so fiercely speak and are proud of for establishing to ensure that a candidate country is ready to join the European Union. Well, the timeline varies and depends on national and global politics and on how much a country needs to reform its own laws to meet the EU standards. For 9 countries, the complete accession process took 10 or more years. Cyprus and Malta each took almost 14 years from the moment they applied for membership till they joined the European Union. So this was the longest of any current member countries. Negotiations took 5 or more years for 11 of the 21 current EU countries that went through the accession process. The negotiations of Portugal took the longest, 6.7 years. Spain, 6.3 years. And Croatia, 6.2 years. Negotiations for Austria, Finland, and Sweden were the quickest, lasting only 1.3 years. So after a country has been granted a candidate status and the pre-accession strategy has been open with the view for the EU to support those countries to meet conditions and criteria laid down in the Copenhagen Declaration and other soft legal instruments, negotiations will start. First, the Council must vote to authorize the opening of the negotiations with a candidate country. Second, Council must vote to approve the Commission's negotiation strategy. The European Commission is responsible for negotiating the accession of a candidate country. The Council will appoint a team of negotiators from the European institutions, and these are generally staff from the European Commission. Negotiations take place over a series of about 30 different clusters, some of which may be negotiated simultaneously. The Council must then, as always, vote unanimously, also in this stage, to close each chapter. If a candidate country's situation will deteriorate during the negotiations and no longer will be able to comply with European standards, and the principle of reversibility will make it possible to reopen the negotiating chapters, with a view to close them timely. The European Commission will then draw up an annual assessment of the negotiations. Throughout the negotiations, the European Commission will brief regularly to the Council of the European Union. And once all negotiating chapters are closed, the European Commission draws up its final opinion on the readiness of a candidate country to join the European Union. this opinion must be voted again unanimously by the Council and by an absolute majority by the European Parliament, which means that even though the Commission might give a positive opinion about a candidate country ready to join the European Union, because of the veto requirement in the Council and also the absolute majority in the Parliament, if that opinion is not voted or does not meet the threshold, the voting threshold, the country will have to wait another year in order to proceed. A new EU member state is obliged to join the Schengen area and the Eurozone, although these steps may take place after accession. For example, although the Czech Republic joined the European Union in 2004, it has not adopted yet the euro. So unanimity in the Council. So you've heard often, and you learned so far, that in every stage of the negotiation, and let me remind you again of the 6 steps in the negotiating process. In each of these steps, Council has the right to vote through unanimity. Now, unanimity has been contested for quite a long time and turned on the agenda in academic and policy debate. To what extent does the unanimity requirement for decision-making in the Council by the member state for the accession of new countries undermine the credibility and the efficiency of the accession process? Would replacing unanimity with qualified majority voting be legally and politically attainable? The unanimity requirement has long been seen as a barrier to effective decision-making. And this is because it allows individual member states, even one of them suffices, to block the progress for reasons that often extend beyond the criteria for accession laid down in the Copenhagen Declaration. For example, Bulgaria's vote on North Macedonia over historical disputes, or Hungary's threat to block accession of Ukraine, or Greek veto against Albania due to past disputes on maritime borders which have not been resolved until now. So from a legal perspective, Article 49 governs the EU enlargement but does not explicitly mandate unanimity for all stages of the negotiation process, for the 6 stages. Instead, unanimity has been established as a legal practice through some negotiation frameworks set by the European Council, not by hard law, not by Article 49 itself, but through some other forms of legal instruments, like negotiation frameworks adopted based on Article 40, but not 49, but not Article 49 itself. So since the treaties, since Article 49 do not strictly require unanimity at every stage, qualified majority could be introduced without a treaty change, making therefore this the only solution to overcome these bottlenecks in the Council, which have delayed for decades accession to the European Union for some candidate countries. Germany and Slovenia have proposed introducing qualified majority at the intermediary stages of accession, such as opening negotiations, closing negotiation chapters, while up to 15 member states support the idea of introducing qualified majority by combining it with unanimity, which certainly would apply in the final stage, which is accession, but not required to apply it at every stage of the accession process. However, there are very critical voices against it, including France, the Netherlands, Hungary, Poland, which are very skeptical and reasonably so, due to concerns over losing their voice in the decision-making process. They want to have a say in the process. Otherwise, they lose oversight and control about the process for accession of new countries. Now, the process of introducing qualified majority in some stages of the process regarding the opening of the negotiation chapters, the closing of the negotiation chapters, which are steps very technical in nature. So if using qualified majority for those technical steps instead of unanimity, then certainly qualified majority could contribute to increased efficiency and therefore reduce the risk of unilateral veto power in decision-making to block countries because of domestic politics in some member states. However, the use of qualified majority is not a safety net completely, because it might not completely prevent member states from stalling progress through alternative political means, such as, for instance, tightening benchmarks or setting or hardening assessment criteria for those countries. But certainly it would be a positive development. It's often discussed, it's still being discussed, but there is not, no initiative has been taken yet. At the end of the negotiations, we reach stage 5, a succession of signatures and votes take place. Firstly, an accession treaty must be approved unanimously by the Council. The European Parliament must also approve the text by an absolute majority. Secondly, the accession treaty must be signed by the government of each member state, as well as the government of the candidate country. Finally, before coming into force, the signed treaty must also be ratified at the acceding country, so at the candidate country, and also by each member state. Since the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty in December 2009, EU member states are required to ratify the accession treaty according to the requirements prescribed in their own constitutions. Today, in the event of further enlargement, most national parliaments would be called upon to vote. France could even hold a referenda, and some regional parliaments may also be called upon to express their view. It is the case, for instance, with Belgium, as prescribed by its own constitution. Within the candidate country, ratification of the accession treaty may be preceded by a referendum vote. Only 6 countries, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Romania, have ratified the treaty without a referenda because of requirements in the constitution of those countries. Once the treaty is signed, the candidate countries acquire the status of acceding country. Once the treaty has been fully ratified by all parties, the candidate country becomes a member state of the EU on the date of the agreed date in the treaty. However, bear in mind that even though the accession treaty will successfully pass a requirement at EU level, it may be blocked at national level because of the ratification requirement by each of the 27 member states. And be mindful that in most of the member states, the citizens will vote through a referenda to accept or not a new member state. So you might consider that not every EU citizen is so well connected and so well informed about political dynamics and talks and discussions at European level to properly assess as to whether a new country should or not join the European Union. So after passing all these hurdles at European level, an accession treaty may fail, and if it happens in one member state, the process is again blocked. So the veto, so not only the Council can veto an accession treaty, but also the member states, through the referenda, can veto an accession treaty. So that requires a well-educated European citizen, well-informed about dynamics beyond their national border, in order to make an informed decision as to whether or not a candidate country can or not become a new member state. So during the period between signature of the accession treaty by the candidate country and ratification, the acceding country can benefit from special arrangement. Firstly, it is informed of EU legislation through an information procedure, and also has the opportunity to comment on several legislative communications and recommendations. And at the same time, it is granted the status of active observers in various EU bodies and agencies, awaiting until the accession treaty enters into force, provided that it has been ratified in all the 27 member states. Now, knowing what you learned so far, I'd like you to take a moment and rethink the topic of enlargement. So would you first argue in favor of widening the EU and therefore enlarge it with new member states to further strengthen European integration? Or would you rather favor deepening integration and strengthen internal reform in order to strengthen the absorption capacity of the European Union to welcome new member states and delay the enlargement agenda? So what would be your reflections, suggestions, comments, maybe any points of critique regarding the topic? Yeah.
Do you think Turkey will ever become a EU member state?
Given the current state of affairs and with the current legal framework, it's hardly possible. So if we go backward on this slide, it's blocked in the Council. It currently is a candidate country over almost 26 years. For 26 years, it's still a candidate country. And even in the event that it successfully passes unanimity in the Council, it can be blocked at the ratification stage. But so far, it's not on the agenda. It's not a priority. Last year, its president actually reconfirmed its intention to progress the accession talks with the EU, but in order to reach that stage, it requires Turkey to open the negotiating chapters. And currently, Turkey is at stage 2. It's a candidate status. And in order to move forward to stage 3, it needs to open the negotiating chapter clusters. Clusters refers to groups of domestic legislation, which must be aligned with European legislation, with the Soterm EU acquis. So far, Turkey, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina has not opened any of the chapters. They are still at stage 2. In the Western Balkans, Albania has opened a chapter, but it's still at stage 3. And so all other candidate countries are at stage 2. And Turkey has been there for 26 years. Certainly the scenario might change, but the focus is primarily now on the Western Balkans due to Russia's influence and on Ukraine. So as of 2024, there are 10 countries aspiring for EU membership. 6 in the Western Balkans: Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And 4 in other regions: Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Turkey. The attitude of the EU towards the Western Balkans has been hesitant, provoking discontent and unease in the region. They were considered as forgotten until the war in Ukraine started, which rekindled the debate on the enlargement of the European Union. The most realistic option would be to handle each potential candidate separately to create some distinct packs for the negotiation. There was a suggestion years ago to allow for accession of the countries in the Western Balkans in bloc, like it happened in 2004 with 10 countries joined in bloc the European Union. Because of the heated dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo, Serbia is a candidate country, because of unsettled dispute between North Macedonia and Bulgaria, therefore this idea was abandoned. And seemingly the European Union is more inclined to embrace an individual accession of countries in the Western Balkans. As suggested earlier, it is expected until now, as based on the state of the art, that Montenegro seems to be the next country to join the European Union, provided it resolves the dispute with Croatia. Because if that bilateral dispute remains unresolved, then certainly Montenegro cannot join the European Union. It is actually a requirement following from the treaty that a candidate country must not have unresolved disputes before joining the European Union, which is not interested that such disputes are exported into the EU legal order after those candidate countries join the European Union. So the idea of accession in bloc has been abandoned by the European Union, and individual accession will therefore take place. Ukraine and Moldova, through a fast-track procedure, which puts to question the merit-based process, as compared to other countries which waited for years until they were granted the candidate status, and some are still on the waiting line. So Ukraine and Moldova has been awarded candidate status because of the current war with Russia. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is considered a very fragile state. So Kosovo is not diplomatically recognized by many countries, including states such as Spain and Greece. Serbia remains close to Russian interests since the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Georgia is unlikely to gain accession anytime soon, given that it has two territories under Russian occupation, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It also lags behind on all development fronts and is geographically distant from the rest of the EU. Now, with regard to Turkey, it seems clear that the EU does not have any real interest in bringing them on board. After 25 years of negotiation, they have only managed to close only one of the 35 chapters in negotiations on compliance of their domestic legislation with the acquis communautaire. So, seeing how things stand at the moment, we hope that Montenegro will succeed to overcome its dispute with Croatia, and provided that the Council votes through unanimity, the member states vote unanimously about its accession, and provided that it gets approval at national levels, primarily through ratification. So the member state, the citizens of the member state will be then convinced that indeed Montenegro is ready to join the European Union. So provided that the European layer and the national layer will have their interests aligned, then there might be, but certainly there is no guarantee on that front yet. And so now that this lecture comes to an end, what are some reflections or some takeaways or questions that you might want to put forward? Are you feeling more optimistic, or rather question the enlargement agenda based on what you learned until now? Would you favor it, or would you rather reconsider it? Is it a step forward or a move backward to rethink the enlargement of the European Union? Yes? Yeah, it's a very valid point. Thank you for raising it. Any other reflection? Certainly, Professor Michael Kemper will dive deeper into specific states in the Western Balkans by providing a historical account of enlargement from the rise of enlargement wave till now. And we'll discuss all the challenges that those countries have gone through, which also explains why they have not, some of them have not moved forward in the process. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes. Are there any skepticals in this room about enlargement? Those who might think that actually it's not yet the time, and would rather opt for not for a wider Europe, but rather favor deeper integration of the current EU. So you think so? then you stand with France. Macron has reiterated it yearly. I'm not sure now with Germany though. So with the current chancellor, who seems to favor that. Any questions? Comments? Okay, then this lecture comes to an end. I hope that you learned what I consider the foundations of European enlargement, and I hope that next week you will be able to dive deeper into enlargement from the historical lens and learn much more through those concrete examples that my colleague will be discussing with you. Thank you for your attention, your attendance, and it was a pleasure to teach you, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.